publishes this address. He gives it at I think it's like the first ever big conference of Black abolitionists. He tries to repopularize Walker, an idea that enslaved people can do the work of emancipation better than any others. While Walker's address is clearly directed kind of to the South, this address is really directed towards the North. It's not telling people anything they don't already. It's not telling enslaved people anything they don't already know. Almost, it's clearly about centering the need for practical support of liberation by any means necessary. This is important. It gets published in 1848. Around 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, and abolitionism moves into kind of mass disloyalism. There's mass freeings. They break into jails, free people from being deported to the South. They deported to slavery. There's the Jerry Rescue in Syracuse. This is like a real big part of New York history. This is Albany, Syracuse, New York City. There's this militant resistant bros. We get this guy, some of you have probably heard of, John Brown. We're maybe going to go through these debates later with the time. If we have time after, maybe we can talk about that. Next slide. So I want to talk a bit about the abolitionist tradition, then move on to Reconstruction. This is a Chinese edition of Du Bois's biography of John Brown. It was made in 1976 by a cell of factory workers. I think that kind of shows maybe a bit of like the legacy of this movement. They really made history in a very literal way. I think it's clear, led this like mass upsurge, made the fugitive slave law unenforceable, and certainly played a big role in heightening the tensions. Marx says after John Brown's raid, like essentially the signal's been cast. This is like the most important thing right now. But they also wrote everything down. They wrote their memoirs. As Reconstruction was ending, they could see that their movement was dwindling, and they very consciously decided to preserve their thought for future generations. And this is as society is kind of turning to empire, as the US is committing colonial genocide within the 48 states borders, but also in the Spanish-American War. Movements follow their footsteps very explicitly, geographically. You can really see the kind of movement from abolitionists to Knights of Labor, who very much see themselves in the same mode as abolitionists, the IWW, the Knights of Labor in the South, really active in many like kind of hotspots of Reconstruction. Also, same towns are really active in the Garveyite movement, the UNIA, another movement socialists really should read about, and also really active in the Southern Tenant Farm Worker Union. It's often like the same towns, even sometimes like the same churches that host these meetings. There's a quote by Garrison. I'm first going to say close the story about Wendell Phillips, which is in 1870, he runs for governor of Massachusetts. He gets 15% of the vote for like a labor party. It's part of the labor movement. But very soon after he leaves it kind of splits up, it dwindles away. A long time, people thought it was because he got a little weird about money. Essentially, he's just started talking about currency too much and calmed down a bit. But actually, recent research has shown it is really clear what the dividend was. Big figures in the labor movement were incredibly anti-immigrant at a time of increasing Chinese immigration and didn't support essentially any rights for them. They used a lot of language that the labor movement actually used before, where they said essentially any labor that's like not free, aka like not white labor, is going to cheapen us, and we can't be in the same country as them because it'll essentially like lower our like worth. I mean, it's a lot of really similar language people use against immigration today. It takes away jobs, that kind of thing, and really, really deeply white supremacist language. Phillips like says, really strongly speaks against this. Says, these are our allies. We are all human. We're all free. The Garrison's Mass said, of course, our country is the world. Our countrymen are mankind. Phillips was standing up for the whole working class. He was supporting the real labor movement, while his foes, his white supremacist rivals, they were supporting the color line. I think that's abolition's legacy, right? Is supporting the whole working class. fighting against the color line in our movements. That is something we really can take away. And that's something people took away throughout in this history. That's the inspiration that leads to this Chinese edition of Du Bois's biography. That's inspiration that Malcolm X finds when he's experiencing this kind of conversion experience, and he finds in the prison library almost like hidden away these moldy abolitionist books and reads them in his radicalization. I'll end with a quote from Garrison. Garrison has some incredible quotes. This is a great one. The millennial state, right, the second coming, that ever come on earth is yet in the far distant future. There are innumerable battles yet to be fought. And those who shall hereafter, us, right, go forth to defend the righteous cause cannot fail to derive strength and inspiration from an intelligent acquaintance with the means and methods of the anti-slavery movement. The pat on the back. And I think this is true. I think it's a message for the whole left. Like, this is a movement we can learn from. It's all online. Just, you know, I'm gonna just end with some names to just Google. You'll find their narratives. They're incredible. William Parker is a great, leads this incredible kind of self-defense, Black self-defense movement in Lancaster, and later, you know, after a kind of mass rebellion, moves to Canada and writes this narrative. William Still, David Walker, H.H. Garnett, Lydia Maria Child, the list goes on. I could talk to you later about it, but we're gonna move on to Reconstruction now.
Thank you, Isaac. I'm Peter. I'm going to talk about Reconstruction, which is, for anyone that doesn't know, basically the period after the Civil War from 1865 until 1877-ish. Next slide. I'm going to open with this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who Isaac already mentioned, and to whom I owe, honestly, like most of my understanding of this period. And he says that the true significance of slavery in the United States to the whole social development of America lay in the ultimate relation of slaves to democracy. What were to be the limits of democratic control in the United States if all labor, Black as well as white, became free, given schools and the right to vote? What control could or should be set to the power and action of people? Was the rule of the mass of Americans to be unlimited, and the right to rule extended to all men, regardless of race and color? Or if not, what power of dictatorship and control, and how would property and privilege be protected? This was the great and primary question which was in the minds of the men who wrote the Constitution of the United States, and continued in the minds of thinkers down through the slavery controversy. It still remains with the world as the problem of democracy expands and touches all races and nations. Next slide. So first, before we get into the events of Reconstruction, I need to talk about a couple critical pieces of context, I think. The first is about the antebellum South. Isaac has already gone through some of this, but really the antebellum South is a whole slave society, as they say. The fact that people owned slaves was not just some like peculiarity. Their entire economy and class system was really based around this. A large majority of slaves were owned by a very small number of wealthy oligarchs. And most poor white people were either marginalized or were co-opted into the systems in roles where they controlled slave labor, like overseers or slave catchers. So this was really like the core of their economy. It also exerted this extreme undemocratic influence over American politics, because even most poor white people in the South could not vote. Slaves obviously couldn't either. So you had this very small minority of people that would get represented equivalent to all of these non-voting whites in their states, as well as we all know, 3/5 of the slaves. The Northerners would actually like try and get the slaves not counted at all when they wrote the Constitution, because they saw that this would give the slaveholding oligarchs more power. So both northern capitalists and northern workers viewed this as competition. And resented the anti-democratic effect it had on the and the end of slavery in the American Civil War was really a second American Revolution. Changes that it brought about affected all of American society, showing a lot of certainties about not just slavery, but about race, about politics, and about profit. And none other than Karl Marx, who's quoted here on the slide, saw it in exactly those terms, and wrote to Abraham Lincoln, encouraging him to see this process through, go forward with emancipation, and was favorably received. So yeah, the Civil War was the battle to end slavery. Reconstruction was kind of a battle to decide what happened next. What would slavery be? Next. So next thing we need to talk about is the U.S. party system at the time of Reconstruction. You can probably already tell all of the names are the same. Things are a little bit different. Karl Marx is writing to a Republican president and to a Republican president. More or less in agreement with it. So anyway, the Republicans were created as an anti-slavery party shortly before the Civil War. They are anti-slavery, but that actually covers a range of opinions about both abolition and race. The key distinction is between the radical Republicans who favor immediate total abolition and the moderates who favor various compromise solutions. Maybe they don't want slavery to expand any further, maybe they're in favor of some sort of gradual abolition. Charles Sumner in this picture and Thaddeus Stevens are two of the leaders of the radical coalition that play a big role in the construction reforms that we're going to talk about. And also, Abraham Lincoln actually starts out as a moderate. He's radicalized during the Civil War. He starts out promising not to immediately take away from slaves. And the Democrats at this time are the party of the slave system, and they will be the anti-construction opposition. So before we move on, both of these are sort of cross-class parties. The Republican Party represents both business and workers in the North, and the Democratic Party represents both the Southern oligarchy and poor Southern whites. Now I'm already for next. All right. So yeah, 5 key events that I'm going to talk about. This is a huge topic. I definitely encourage you to learn more about it. This is not everything that happens. But we're going to talk about emancipation. We're going to talk a little bit about the military occupation itself. We're going to talk about some of the reforms that happened during this period. We're going to talk about how people participated in this Second American Revolution, and finally, we are going to talk. It was all unwound. Well, not all of it. Next slide. So emancipation. It formally starts when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863. But this only applies to slaves on Confederate territory. So no one actually gets freed until either the Union front reaches them or they flee to the safety of the Union lines, which they do in large numbers. Isaac already mentioned that this is, Du Bois calls this a general strike against the Confederacy, and it really does, along with a Union blockade and just the war in general, help to correct the Southern, which is totally reliant on slave labor. And then after these slaves emancipate themselves, many will go on to join the Union Army, first just as laborers or camp followers, and then later in the war, once the Union Army starts accepting Black recruits, they will join as combat troops. And in this way, they will play a part in liberating not only themselves, but other slaves. So you can definitely see that enslaved people played a huge vital role in their own emancipation. As socialists, we believe that the action of oppressed classes is like essential to their liberation. The role of slaves in emancipation is something that really vindicates that. There were also some experiments with redistributing property to these newly freed slaves or freedmen during the war. The first one is in Port Royal, South Carolina, where plantation owners flee and leave behind several thousand slaves. The Union Army basically sets them up on the land in the South Carolina Sea Islands, sends doctors, school teachers, and missionaries to help them become self-sufficient. But there are still actually Black families that own land from this gesture in the South Carolina Sea Islands to this day. So it's successful. Later, in 1865, I think, General Sherman, as he's marching to the sea across the South, will issue this thing, Special Field Order number 15, which will set aside large tracts of land to redistribute to slaves in 40-acre plots, the freedmen. He actually decides to do this after a meeting with Black religious leaders who specifically asked him for it. I will quote Garrison Frazier, a minister who spoke on their behalf in this meeting. He said that the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it until it by our own labor. That is, by the labor of women and children and old men. And we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And to assist the government, young men should enlist in the service of the government and serve in such a manner as they may want to be placed on the land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. This is also likely the origin of the 40 acres of mule phrase that you often hear, reference to the government's broken promises to Black people. Spoiler alert, this promise gets broken. Next slide. This is actually a picture of some of these slaves in Port Royal Sea Island, freed slaves, on their lands. Next slide. So, as the Civil War winds down and the Union Army takes over more and more of the South, they set up military occupation. The Civil War ends when the Confederate Army is defeated in the field, but Southern resistance to emancipation absolutely does not. It continues using both legal and illegal means to keep Black people in close to slave-like conditions as is possible. For legal means, they use these things called black codes, which basically recreate slave conditions in all but name. These are later struck down, but they also use terror and intimidation. The KKK is founded during this period, and they use violence to prevent free people from participating in politics. Next slide. So yeah, before we get into some of the reforms that happened during this period, I wanted to put it to the audience and ask what we think are going to be some of the tasks facing these Reconstruction governments in the wake of the Civil War. So yeah, slavery is gone. What do we do next?
Employment for Black people.
Yes, definitely. That's a big one because these people have no property. They've been prevented from getting education for the most part. Yeah, it's a big important thing to do.
Yeah, well, the slave economy, the economy was based on slavery.
Yes.
So those methods created a product that was the product of super exploitation. So there was a big market for cotton at slave labor prices, but then cotton at any kind of non-slave labor prices. There was no market for it for a while. And so a new economy had to develop that was not based on slavery, and there was no infrastructure for anything but slavery.
Yes, that is also definitely correct, particularly for the business wing of the Republican Party. Getting the flow of cotton started again at reasonable prices was a huge concern. In the back, what's your name?
Marlowe. The South didn't have really any social infrastructure, period, including public education and really basic stuff. And like even literacy, even among the white population, was trash compared to the North at the time. So they kind of had to bring civilization and modernity there.
Yes, exactly. The South was like lagging very far behind in terms of public services. That is something that happened during Reconstruction.
It wasn't done very well, but they had to like do some amount of suppression of like white counter-revolution as it happened in various places that cropped up.
Yes. Also, sorry. Any last takers on this? All in the back.
Inflation of cotton.
Yeah. That was another big one.
Can you say it again?
Inflation of cotton, once the slave system was destroyed and a lot of the farmland in the South was destroyed, and really put the squeeze on the supply of cotton, which is an important thing for northern industry to have.
How about militias? Like, how do you arm the South? Like, who gets to have arms?
Yes, that was definitely an important question. The Union Army kept that under control temporarily, but we need to find a longer term solution. Military occupation. Lee, and then
So, you know, one of the things driving towards the Civil War was the fact that the country was becoming industrialized, and the areas that had railroads were going to be successful, and the areas that didn't were not going to be successful. So both the South and the North, the ruling classes wanted railroads, but the terms of the railroads was different everywhere. So that was a big fight. They both wanted it, but what were the terms? And there was a lot of money for it, but it was mostly stolen.
yeah, we're gonna talk more about that later,
Oh,
but that is
okay,
also
sorry.
no, I think actually the Transcontinental Railroad, you don't necessarily think of these two things in conjunction, but it was completed at like right about the time. So like they were happening very much. Next slide. To continue. So first and possibly the most important reform that came out of Reconstruction is these three constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which I will quote directly now. The 13th Amendment bans slavery, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. 14th Amendment extends citizenship, civil rights protection to all U.S. citizens, and protects it at the federal level. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection from the laws. This amendment also cancels Confederate war debt and bans ex-Confederate polling operatives, which is essential to suppressing the power of the Southern aristocracy. Finally, the 15th Amendment extends the right to vote to all men. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or approved by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of service. So these are hugely important amendments. They extend essential liberal rights to millions of people in the United States for the first time. Also by allowing freedmen and many poor whites who were previously banned from voting under the old Southern system to vote. It makes progressing the Reconstruction process democratically a possibility. And actually the Republican Party will win elections in the 1860s and early 1870s on the backs of freedmen and Reconstruction supporters. So that does happen at least. Another really essential reform that happens during Reconstruction is the Freedmen's Bureau, which sets up, it's set up under military jurisdiction to meet the needs of newly emancipated slaves. But it also extends basic public services like public schools and hospitals into the South for the first time. Someone mentioned that earlier. And it's the Freedmen's Bureau that gets this process rolling. And it also, provides for basic material needs, food, shelter, medicine. Remember, most of these people have nothing, literally, but clothes on the backs. There is some early interest in further land redistributions under the jurisdiction of this Freedmen's Bureau, but that I don't think it even gets a vote. Unfortunately, they do not build on the experiments. So it does, kind of on that note, it does have a dual purpose. It needs to both consolidate the state itself. The old Confederate state is destroyed. There's the military occupation, but people aren't like, there hasn't been a new state formed with the consent of the Southern population. So the Freedmen's Bureau helps to stabilize the economy so that can happen, but it is also about achieving justice for the freedmen. And those two goals sometimes are complementary, sometimes they are not. And unfortunately, it is usually the consolidating state that gets priority. And it is also undermined by constant bickering of jurisdiction and funding, the same stuff that tends to happen whenever the government tries to do something good in this day and age. So some things change, some things don't. Unfortunately. Next slide. There is also this huge upsurge of independent participation by large groups of people. Most obvious thing, of course, is that freedmen are now legally allowed to participate in politics in America for the first time, and they do. Most of them make full use of their right to vote. Some of them run for office, some of them are elected to office and real political power. We've got Congressman Robert Smalls, who freed himself and other slaves from capturing Confederates' vote, and then was elected to several terms in Congress. There are many more like him. Don't have time to get into now, but definitely worth looking into. There is also a large movement of people from the North, called carpetbaggers by the Southerners, who travel south to some just want to get rich quick. Anyone just want to get rich quick, but a lot of them are former abolition activists. They have altruistic motives and continue the work that they started in the abolition movement. And they do this by working in schools, charity hospitals, and it is kind of a nice complement to the official work that the Freedmen's Bureau, which is underfunded and tied down arguments about jurisdiction and stuff, are doing. There are also some white Southerners who support Reconstruction. They're called scalawags by the anti-Reconstruction Southerners. This is not a majority. most southern whites oppose Reconstruction, but they are out there. And I also wanted to give this quote from this is a carpetbagger, former abolition activist named Charlotte Horton Griffith, who traveled south from the north to work at a school in Fort Royal, actually. She said, "I shall dwell again among mine own people. I shall gather my scholars about me, see smiles of greeting break over the dusky faces. My heart sings a song of thanksgiving at the thought that even I am committed to do something for a long abused race." So yeah, just people do genuinely want to do nice things for each other, feel solidarity. Don't forget that. Next slide. So yes, unfortunately, as we all know, white supremacy didn't end in 1860. A lot of the gains that we just talked about were rolled back. And the first sour note gets hit very early on when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at the end of the Civil War. His successor is his vice president, a guy called Andrew Johnson, who is a big racist, and who does not really support Reconstruction. Fortunately, the radical Republicans have sufficient support in Congress to continue the process without him being on board. But it does introduce a lot of like confusion, kill a lot of the momentum. In particular, he pardons all of the ex-Confederates, and this really helps to kill whatever momentum it was for further property redistribution. Taking it property as a war measure or as a punishment for crime is one thing, but taking it from people that are not on trial for anything in time of peace, it's way too close to home for most of the American political establishment. So yeah. The other thing is that immediately these terrorist organizations, most famously the Ku Klux Klan, but there are plenty of other ones, spring up to use violence and intimidation to stop the Reconstruction process however they can, whether that's suppressing freedmen from participating in politics or like, you know, attacking anyone that wants to fight back against the re-enslavement of Black people. Their efforts are key to electing the so-called redeemer governments that will then go on to legally disenfranchise the freedmen and reestablish white supremacy. So like, do bear in mind that that's not something that got elected in a free election. It got elected under threat of violence in these terrorist organizations. There was also corruption to talk about. After the reestablishment of white supremacy, there will be the Dunning School of History about Reconstruction, which will basically blame all of the corruption and the chaos of that period on freedmen voting. This is a false narrative. The main instigators of and beneficiaries of corruption in this period is big business, who exercise a strong corrupting influence over not just the South, but all American politics. The freedmen, they don't get their 40 acres of this, so this is not really their fault. But there is a lot of corruption, and that does help to breed fatigue with the project and mistrust of it, which makes its defeat easier. And then the event that finally brings it to a close is what's called the corrupt bargain. The presidential election of 1876 was disputed, and the Democrats agreed to seat Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president in exchange for him removing the last remaining Union troops from the South. As I said earlier, that was the sort of bulwark against these terrorist organizations having free reign. Once those troops are gone, the terrorist organizations suppress participation by Reconstruction supporters, elect these redeemer governments. The redeemer governments legally disenfranchise freedmen, and white supremacist rule is established in the South. So yeah, next slide. So yeah, there was a bunch of positive signs. Democratic reforms happened, people were engaged in this process, so why didn't it work out better? And I call it a defeat, both in the sense that a lot of what things there were rolled back. But also, I think it was a big missed opportunity. Stuff that wasn't even really tried, like property distribution, particularly, could have changed the course of American history. The fact that that wasn't attempted is as big of a defeat as the fact that what was attempted did not end up being taken. So Du Bois thinks, and rightly so, that a coalition between freedmen and white workers had enormous political potential at this time. Unfortunately, it did not come together. Labor organizing was really still in its infancy at this time. Most of the unions that were out there had a very narrow vision of their members' interests. They saw freedmen as competition, or they just thought it was not really their problem to involve themselves in. So this coalition never materializes. The Republican Party also proved to be very unreliable, because it was, remember, both the party of big business and of northern workers. So when some of the aims of Reconstruction started to come into conflict with its business interests, when they started to run into difficulties stabilizing the state in the South, they were happy to reach out to the old Southern ruling class and cut a new deal with them so that they could dominate society together. And they were quite explicit about this. Thanks to Isaac for this quote from Alfred Simpkinson, who was a Cincinnati businessman and Republican, talking about, I'm sure if the editors of this paper could understand how we have striven for Southern trade, they would not keep up this fomentation and strife. Businessmen, more than any other class, have been trying to cement the North and South together in closer relations, and nothing can accomplish that great object more rapidly than the amenities of commerce and the ties of business. No shame, they were totally happy to make compromises with the old Southern ruling class at the expense of the freedmen. There's also, as I've said several times, the failure to redistribute property, which left the freedmen in relations of economic dependence with white property owners. This is a feature of capitalism. Workers are also in relations of economic dependence with capitalists, and that helps to make us unfree. Same is true with the freed slaves. Had they gotten land to farm independently, would have been on a much stronger footing to exercise their political rights, make their freedom real. There is also the role of racist ideology, which is important. Du Bois talks about a psychological rage of whiteness, which is basically the idea is that the feeling of superiority that white people get from living in white supremacist society can, to some extent, compensate for their material poverty. Because remember, this white supremacist system is not actually good for most white people. They're also marginalized by it. So again, this racist ideology, it not only helps to disorganize the oppressed classes by making them see their interest as separate or competition when they're really not, but it also helps cohere support for the ruling class without giving away much in the way of material possessions. And yeah, this is a very important forging political coalitions that will define the next 50-ish years of American politics. Nevertheless, there were some enduring successes. Constitutional amendments were important. The civil rights movement would look back at Reconstruction, gains it achieved, and try and recreate some of those, recapture some of those us. So yeah, overall, didn't work out the way I think any of us would like it to, but it was not a total loss either. So yeah, I will now put it to the group before we finish up. You know, what can we as organizers today, pretenders, in social revolutions, learn from some of the successes and failures of this period? In the back.
You can't have a political overall while still having the group you overthrew still within that political system.
Yes, I think, yeah, it should have been harder on the old Confederate elites, definitely. Something that. Okay,
I hate to say it, but yeah, might is right in a way, or not that it's right, but it wins. Because I think that the South that lost got a lot of its privileges back just through violence, and I think it's similar to what the person in the back was saying, that these are real concerns, like you don't just.
yeah, no, definitely, I think not only like their presence, but their continued willingness to use violence, by their refusal to like bow to democracy.
And also, once the military is removed, right, then
Yeah,
that's
no,
when it was just done, like the South
Yeah.
won again, or the South won Reconstruction.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Military dictatorship was absolutely necessary to like set the foundation. The fact that it was removed before those foundations were finished, the Reconstruction was a failure. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I want to read it. Says, what can we learn from the Socialist and federal recreation? That's what I mean about this.
yeah,
So we have do we have to do like you say about the democracy, right?
yeah. Yeah, no, this established democracy, at least briefly, in the Southern American states where it had basically never existed up to this point. That was important when. Okay,
Yeah, to continue the thread that people before me mentioned, if we conceptualize the state of enslaved Black people in the South as their own society, as their own group of a class as they existed, and also as Lee mentioned earlier, and also people mentioned earlier in terms of like the production of cotton in the world, you know, it was the foundation of cotton. In fact, it was like the #1 export of any product in the world, and was instrumental to the British Empire. And so if we conceptualize it in that way, then the population of Black people that were enslaved in this country were a colony that existed. So then if you conceptualize it in that way, then it was a national liberation struggle, right? Then if we conceive it in that way, and then we, you know, there's that first line in Wretches of the Earth by Frantz Fanon that's like, decolonization is always a violent process. So if we remember that, then therefore we must remember that the only way to make sure that that a nation is liberated under the yoke of colonialism is by liberating oneself by any means necessary. And in reverse, as we've learned throughout history, the only way that can develop a oppressed population is through a dictatorship of the proletariat.
yeah. There is a good quote. I have not read Frantz Fanon, fortunately, but there's also a good quote in one of Leon Trotsky's essays where he contrasts the use of force to break the chains of slavery versus the use of force to maintain them. It says they're not morally Oh, in the back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Miriam. India threw off colonialism without a violent revolution. And it did. The British Empire, the collapse wasn't. So I think
I don't feel super qualified to comment on that part of history, to be honest. Yes, I guess the British Empire did leave India peacefully, but I think there was a lot of violence surrounding that event.
yes, but it wasn't there was violence, but it wasn't primarily a violent thing.
Yeah,
In a war, so I think that
It ended with the partition of India and Pakistan, which is one of the most violent.
Yeah, exactly.
episodes of the 20th century.
yeah, no, I guess I take your point that the Indians did not have to fight a war against the British.
right,
To liberate
and
themselves.
so I think that people are being too fast to just say that all decarbonization and all liberation has to be. It often has to be, and it often has been. But I don't think that it should. I don't think that it's desirable, and it's not something that we should just be embracing because Trotsky said it.
Right.
Yes, let's be clear, the Civil War was like a huge crisis for America. More Americans died in that conflict than any other war to date, including World War II. This is like not something that you want to take lightly. And I think also that what is key to both the Indian liberation and the liberation of slaves is the involvement of the Indian people, the slaves themselves. Whether that's violent, non-violent, both, as it usually is, I would say, it is essential.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to add that, like, it didn't, colonialism continued, post, national liberation. I think that's one of the main kind of, issues kind of coming across, and certainly comes across in Reconstruction. And I think maybe like grounding it in militancy, makes sense, and I think that's something you really get from like bringing it back to like David Walker and H.H. Barnett. That's really the message, is they're really grounding it in militancy and self-determination, in moving, in unifying like the Black people in the US and actually like across, I think pretty clearly across the Atlantic, across the Caribbean as one people. H.H. Barnett says a lot, remember, we are 3 million. And I think that kind of like putting ourselves up as protagonists, and a key part of organizing is talking about oppressed people as protagonists, as in giving and having our own voice, our own spaces. I think these are really important things brought up even back in David Walker, and I think there's a reason, right? He's not being taught in schools, and the lessons are I think really about, really kind of centering people as oppressed people as victims. And I think more than anything, it's seeing people as protagonists, seeing liberation through militancy, liberation through self-determination, and really with Walker, it is a really like self-determination. Like it's almost like there's certainly a psychological thing, which I think is like really important in like Marcus Garvey's influence as well, and his work and the mass movement under his name. And I think these are like really key parts of organizing, and definitely something I really try and center in tenant organizing, is the idea of like tenants are the protagonists in this struggle. Like we are the ones who are going to free ourselves, and that's tenants as protagonists fighting against gentrification. It's not something that change isn't going to come from kind of top from politicians, from people doing things on our behalf. It's going to become from our own self-determination and our own liberation. And that's, I think, something that's really clear in Reconstruction. Is the Republican Party totally was not that. It totally betrayed the cause.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I cannot be too emphatic about the central treatment formerly enslaved people played. Ernst.
I think to your point, I don't think you want to fetishize violence at all. I mean, I think that's very dangerous. But at the same time, when I
We
was,
can't hear you.
I said, to your point, I don't think any one of us, at least I hope we don't want to fetishize the violent nature, and I don't think that's what you're doing. At the same time, I think the particular circumstances and nature of the Civil War and Reconstruction, I don't think there's any way to understand that without understanding that it literally took the arming of Black men to free Black people from slavery. I think that's, I just think that's objective fact, which is not to say that there are not circumstances in which that's not as necessary. But in this case, the freedom of Black people was literally came through with barrel of gun. And that doesn't mean that we should all be storming outside with our, AK-47. Anyway, but I just wanted to clear that so people, I don't think anyone here, I hope not, believes that.
So the Zoom stack.
Let's take the first one.
All right, Nico, you're up.
Hello. To the comrade's point who was just speaking, I agree that it's not a fetishism of violence, but rather a understanding of the the necessary conditions that the ruling class is imposing on us, and what lengths they will go to counter any revolution. As we know, the Reconstruction was ended by the disarming of Black militias, by the wanton violence of white militias against Black politicians. There's some crazy statistic about the correlation between the amounts of increase in violence towards Black elected officials and the increase in tax on white property owners. Like every like decimal, like or tenth of a decimal that it goes up, they're like 3 murders of politicians. I don't know, I might be exaggerating, but it was a lot. It was staggering enough to show or to provide a psychic kind of implication towards Black people that if they chose self-determination, they would be murdered, and their tribunes would be murdered as well. And the Black militia members and the members who were in the Union Army gave up their weapons when the Army came back and said, okay, you have to give us your weapons, because they assumed, I mean, not all of them, but some assumed that, okay, we have democracy, we have Reconstruction, nothing's going to happen. And it proved to be a fatal decision. And violence is what brought the end to Reconstruction. So it's kind of naive to say that we can never hope for violence or whatever. Violence is a reality, and it's a reality that many of us exist in today, and it's something that we need to be prepared for.
Yeah, I mean, I do kind of agree with that. Do you remember it's the Southern ruling class that fires the first shot when they seceded after a moderate Republican president who promised not to take their slaves right away? So, yeah, there's no talking stuff, unfortunately. And
yeah, hi, Chip. So just a quick comment about violence and then more broadly about Reconstruction. So I think it's important to conceptualize that not engage in the sort of fetishization of violence. However, I do think it's important to kind of redefine what violence is. Violence is struggle against a particular class system and a particular ruling class. As Rosa, I hate to be the person who's like, as Rosa Luxemburg said, but as Rosa Luxemburg said, and she killed it, no ruling classes have been broken without a period of social rupture, without a violent struggle. And that violent struggle doesn't always take the form of civil war or armed insurrection. It often has, including in India, in the Indian national liberation movement, not come about merely through, Gandhi and this kind of image of like the nonviolent resistance, but in fact through many militant actions by the Indian people, by a constant guerrilla movement, and by a war, a worldwide war against fascism and the inability of the British Empire to continue painting itself as like a bastion of democracy while it was so clearly oppressing people in India. More broadly on Reconstruction though, I'm really interested in Du Bois's argument that Ignatiev brings up in one of the readings, that we can think of Reconstruction as a proto-dictatorship of the proletariat. before the Paris Commune, before the Russian Revolution. And he kind of, takes a step back from that and says, oh, well, it's like the dictatorship of the proletariat, but maybe not really. And Ignatiev brings up that like the commune itself, often like the sort of perennial example of like, this is what communism looks like in action, like didn't actually abolish private property, right? So I think that's a really interesting and good framing of like, this isn't just a sort of democratic revolution. Isaac talked about this too, that exists in this kind of liberal theology of American history, like where we just like keep getting more progressive and better as like, instead it's this this national liberation movement that has a very strong proletarian current in it, that establishes a kind of dictatorship of proletariat. I think we can, even in defeat, I think has a lot of lessons in its defeat.
Ben. We can go and talk about violence. I think we could get bogged down. Something. What I wanted to say is, what I feel like Du Bois emphasizes again and again is so important and interesting about these texts is, particularly for today, is he's using it as what, among other things, to argue, like white people, the majority of white people have had a lot to gain from the end of Black slavery, and that that racism benefited them materially in some ways, but like the end of slavery brought a potential for a progress for a lot of people. I mean, literacy, public schools, and social institutions of all kinds were built in that situation that actually advanced everyone. And it's the great tragedy of it is that racism did prevent that from consolidating away, and the entire to this day the South has lower standards of living than unless it absolutely. So I think that's a really a meaty thing we can take away from this. It just, the last little thing is, I mean, there's been all this talk about Confederate monuments, since the protests of the last few years, and I'm sure a lot of people know that those weren't actually mostly made in that period, right out of the war. They were made at the end of the 19th century, in a time of populism. The first when there actually was a mass movement of farmers, Black and white, coming together that put a serious challenge. We still have the word populist because it was such a big deal. And in that context, the Southern ruling class, reactivated the mythology of this romantic Southern thing. In addition to terrorizing Black people, those images of like the white general were saying, you love your master. Remember that? You loved your master, and that was a way to break a movement that once again had a chance to bring both people of a multiracial coalition together. I think that's one of the important things from this period that we should talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I did not talk for a long time about the role of racist ideology in breaking Reconstruction, but it was huge. And yeah, I think you also set me up for a plug for our next section about labor movements in exactly that period where this thing about racist ideology being used to break up social movements will definitely come up again. So come back in 2 weeks to hear more about it. I'll let back.
So I wonder if like the like currently we're in sort of we're in a garment slavery still currently in other countries where it still gets those countries get labeled as communist, but we still force labor in fast fashion within those countries. So I'm I guess learning from the successes is that we can eradicate the slavery of international countries as well as even domestically within the prison system. In regards to still the cotton industry is still happens to have its hold. That if we can lead to a further globalization of folks to be able to get further places as a success of it's no longer a north-south split, I mean that's lightly speaking, but then it wouldn't be as much of a slavery there is what in garment industry can be eradicated, and potentially we can have this whole, we can ease the lines on this whole capitalist communist split.
Interesting. We do need to wrap up soon, I think, so.
But yes, I just want to say a quick thing, probably in a similar vein, like I feel like the less talked about aspect also is the arch conservativeness of the Supreme Court in Reconstruction. And how like Congress is always conservative, but like even the Supreme Court back then is still like pulling back even further. So I feel like the lesson is just they always suck.
Yeah.
Burn the Constitution. Let's go.
Yeah. Excellent point, and then, Lee and Ernest, and then probably time for announcements.
Yeah, so, you know, our series of classes here is sort of American socialism. And, you know, socialism, the struggle for socialism has to be understood as an entire historical act. In other words, a whole period, and there's going to be progress, and for the United States, we have to understand that one of the first places where the shoots of socialism came out is in this period, so that's why we're doing that. That's why this is part of it. And in a whole historical period, there's more revolutionary and less revolutionary periods, but you need to have the right policies for those periods, regardless of what they are. So the violence isn't from us, it's from them, you know, and so we need nonviolent tactics for the nonviolent periods, but we have to understand that the violence against us will come in certain periods. But we don't want to be reformists, you know, so what is that? That is, are the people themselves taking their future in their hands? And that's what happened there. That's where the shoots of socialism is, that the masses themselves took their life in their hands and came up with new policies. Universal education. There wasn't universal, even in the North. There wasn't. It didn't exist. These were revolutionary ideas for the whole country.
Yeah.
You know, and so in each period, so when we look at reform, or, you know, a real struggle for socialism, that's the difference. Are we putting the struggle in the hands of a few leaders, or are we putting it in the masses' hands?
Yeah.
And we can do that in any period. We can do it in a violent period. We can do it in a non-violent period. That's our challenge. And we're going to learn from history in this period how people did or didn't do it in each of these times.
Ernest.
I said, real quick. So I think it's something, I think in Reconstruction, he said something to your point, like some crazy number of whites like bounce with blacks, right? Like from the South, they're like, yo, like we're out too. But like, I think, right. And so, yeah, that's like, yo, I'm done with this. I'm done with it. But so my question, and and I guess if I had to answer, then, you know, or like many of us had to answer, like, why are white people still so invested in whiteness? I guess is my question. And I'm not asking anyone, but like, and I've been trying to figure this out for years. Like, I'm like, is that good? I'm like, is it really that good? Like, so I mean, even back then, and I think there's that wonderful book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, which tries to figure this out, and not fully, but like, that's a fascinating read. And I got to go back on that. But that's really what I want to take away from this. Like, where has this country, where has the left failed? And really, I don't know. And lastly, is it that good to be white? I mean, has it? No, I mean, no, this is a real question. I mean, like, was that deal really, really good? And I think for many, was the material goods that great? And maybe for many it was. I don't know this, but that's a question I really would like to have. I would really like to struggle with.
What do you want to answer?
Yeah, Stephen back.
I do not have a direct response to that.
Sorry. Oh man, I got the answer.
Perhaps like something related that, one thing that struck me really was, Southern resentment, and because I do think they got off so like, and I have my own, feelings of like, well, Reconstruction failed, Jim Crow came, yet there is still like so much of our politics that was based on the resentment of the Civil War. And I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there as you are, like this whiteness of it, also like, they got so light and they're still so effing pissed. It doesn't make any sense, and I don't know what that tells us, because if we had instituted like a terror over the South for 30, 40 years, I don't know if that would have necessarily borne fruit. It might have just created more resentment. I mean, part of me, like, I guess I agree with the comment here, it's deserved, but pragmatically, I don't think there is a direct line towards getting this country, which is multiracial, to work in any kind of comprehensive way for terror. I don't think that that's necessarily a path towards progress. I think that morally, yes, that's what's deserved, but it's like it just seems short-sighted. And but I'm with Colonel Sherman and everything. I love marching through Georgia. Anywho, yes, last one.
In the blue sweater is gonna be the last comment, unfortunately, because we're at time. Yeah, in terms of like why white people are so invested in whiteness, to your point. My 2 cents are, I think it's a desire for recognition, like even if like in that racist way, because I think people want to feel, I guess, recognized in the culture that they're in, and so if you can feel kind of superior to another group, that is a form of recognition. And then when you look at people that cling to racist symbols like the Confederate flag in the South, a lot of those people are very like poor. And I think it is because they're people who feel like there aren't sources in their life of dignity. And so I think it's a way to kind of try and perversely build up your dignity through feeling superior to other people. But I actually don't think that most white people are invested in whiteness. I think there's a subset of white people that are invested in it as kind of that identity to set them apart from other people, like I said. And it tends to be people who don't have a lot of dignity in their lives in other ways. But in terms of like the average person, Fortune 500 CEO, I think they care about money, and I don't think they care like how diverse the people on their board is. I don't think they care necessarily about language or cultural, like, I think they're invested in keeping the system the way it is, but I don't think they're invested in whiteness necessarily. They'll use that insofar as it's convenient or not, depending on the context, and sometimes it's not anymore as the culture kind of shifts and changes. But that's what I think about.
Just 2 reading recommendations going on. Just read Racial Capitalism and Whiteness as Property by Cheryl Harris. Like whiteness as status property.
What was the name of the author?
Cheryl Harris.
Cheryl Harris.
Whiteness as property.
All right, and on that note, we do have to go to announcements. There's one more slide. Announcements on it right there.
I think invite people to continue the conversation, like sometimes we go out to like a bar,
Yes,
or get food.
where are we going?
That could. Right.
Is that the right? No. Yeah.
Yeah, here's some of the stuff that's going on and say.
That's the hat.
I have a comment paper.
Yeah.
Oh, let's go.
Okay, announcements. First. PSA has expenses, please do chip in if you can afford it. Guaranteed the pass bicycle helmet or the.
We could Venmo, right?
Yeah, the virtual one or Venmo on the side right here.
I haven't carried cash since 88.
Then,
Having cash on me in like weeks and weeks. Oh my God, this helmet.
Are you gonna?
I'm sorry.
What is it?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So our next, hang on everyone, I'm gonna institute some order. Yes, we're not done. No, we have announcements to give.
So, if you are not a DSA member, or any of you not DSA members, according to you, okay, yeah. You can become a DSA member here. It really does. I really love this organization, and yeah, that's as much of a pitch as I can give. It means a lot to me. We are having our next session in 2 weeks in this exact space at 7 p.m. We're going to be talking about the labor movement with Stephen, right, and Peter, yeah, and Jamie virtually. That's going to be incredible. Reading about old labor movement is just, I love reading old books about the labor movement, and I hope at the end of this you will too. And budget push, the budget, it's budget week. Everyone I know who's working on this is incredibly stressed out. If you see frazzled DSA members with some hair flying off, it's because they're really stressed out about this. It's the last week. I think if you go to this QR code, it's a probably like a letter, I imagine, or what is it for?
It's an email.
It's an email to Kathy Hochul. Very easy. You just click a button. You can customize it. You could add in some language from the abolitionist movement, add in some fire. That's my challenge to you.
Do it.
And please do it. Yeah. That's it.
And by the way, I just came to Albany today. It's saying, I was at Albany.
What did you do? For the conduct of justice?
Yeah.
Hochul's already arrested a whole bunch of people who were who were outside her office.
Okay, and what bar are we gonna go to?
One bar. So we'll meet outside, and then we'll just sign outside.
Okay, DeMarcus.
The chair.
Yes.
Whatever chair you're sitting on. And then if you wanna hang out after, you know,